introduce to you an opening which I invented named the Qside Ruy Lopez. Now, many people have played the Verisov before me and invented it for themselves, but I also invented this for myself. And many, many, many things in history have been rediscovered and reinvented. So there you have it. I did not bring light to mankind, but I brought it to myself in the case of this opening. So one day I was sitting around trying to think of logical moves you could play in the chess openings that people didn't tend to play very frequently. This is something I often sit around doing. And, you know, some days it leads to one knight h3, and that's not logical. And no, I've never actually thought that was a good move, but I have played it. But sometimes it means, you know, you sit and look at b3 and try and think again, like, what's good and bad about this move? Is there a way to get an opening advantage with it or an interesting game? And on one such day, I was thinking about openings and what seemed logical. And I started wondering about knight to c3, trying to play e4, and basically knight f6 seemed like the only move, and then bishop g5. As we talked about the other day when we compared e4 and d4 openings, there are some openings like the London system or the Italian game, which you might be able to play on one side, but not on the other side of the board. Some openings you can flip around and some you can't. We talked about differences between the King's Gambit and the Queen's Gambit, right? And how one might be way better than the other. There are sometimes relations between these two openings when you flip them symmetrically, and sometimes less so. You know, there's like the Smith-Morra Gambit and the Goring Gambit, which both share some characteristics with the Blackmer-Deemer Gambit, as we discussed. Because they're both openings where you're actually going to have the same kind of pawn structure, but flipped. In the opening, there's nothing super dramatic that happens. And then you get pressure on the two semi-open files and sort of play it in a sense positionally. So there's some relations there. Okay, so this one came up to me. I was like, if the Queen's Gambit can be flipped to the King's Gambit, the other most popular opening in all of chess is the Ruy Lopez, right? Along with the Queen's Gambit. So how bad would it be to play the Ruy Lopez with your queen side instead of your king side? So the position that we need to compare this to is this one here. Okay, so flip back and forth. What are the different strengths and weaknesses of these two openings? What can they each achieve the same or not achieve the same? And should this queenside version of the Ruy Lopez be good or okay or bad? So this opening had been played before quite a bit, the Verisov, but for the most part, it's been played differently than the way I interpreted it. Okay. For the most part, this opening was played either to play like bishop takes f6 and give a doubled pawn and play it kind of more like an opening called the, I don't even know if it has a name, Trompovsky, or d4, d5, bishop g5, some like Tory type lines. Also, I found that there was a line where people play queen d3 and then quickly like e4. With the queen on d3. That's a little bit more in the style of what I was thinking. So, anyway, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this opening compared to the Ruy Lopez? Well, this opening seeks to fight for this pair of squares e4 and d5. What do we know about that pair of squares? Is it easier or harder for white to get control of e4 and d5 in the queen pawn openings, or easier for white to get control of d4 and e5 in the king side openings? Those of you who've seen my segment on d4 versus e4 should know the answer to this cold. And the others of you, try and figure it out for yourselves. Which pair of squares does white have the better chances of taking control over? That's right. It is harder to get control over e4 and d5. As far as pressure on d5, it's already defended in extra time, right? And as far as trying to play e4, you don't have your queen here backing up the move e4. So both d5 and e4 are each kind of like one important step harder for you to either pressure or get control over. So in general, the task that you're setting out to do with this queenside version of the Ruy Lopez is a harder task than the one that you set yourself with the normal Ruy Lopez. Okay, so that is a clear disadvantage to this opening. Okay. Is there any advantage to playing this queenside Ruy Lopez compared to the kingside Ruy Lopez? What other differences do you notice about the position, and are those things going to help or hurt you? Can anyone think of an advantage to the queenside Ruy Lopez over the kingside Ruy Lopez? I'm glad that every single one of you got the right answer about the pair of squares in the center that we're trying to control. All right, so one advantage is that our d4 is already protected. Definitely true. The natural protection of the queen. There's a lot of variations in the Ruy Lopez where black, yes, loses control over d4 and e5, but counterattacks e4, right? So for example, there's the Schliemann, which is based on this right away. There is also the opening that has caused every 2800 in the world in the last year, not every 2800, has caused a lot of the top 20 players in the world to switch from the Ruy Lopez to the Italian game. This one stupid move attacking your e-pawn, obviously you don't expect a big opening advantage playing a move like d3, so the main line has always been castling, and top players, starting with Kramnik against Kasparov in the World Championship match 15 years ago, have been playing knight takes e4 and finding that they're able to defend the Berlin endgame. And this is all based on the fact that that e4 pawn is hanging. And they can directly attack it on move 3, and white doesn't have the satisfactory answer they want to both defend the pawn and pursue their plan of playing d4. Right, so if they play d3, they're not winning control of d4 e5 anytime soon. Are we agreed on that? That once you play this, your chances of controlling d4 and pressuring e5 in the early game have just taken a nosedive. Same with knight c3, because now you don't have c3 to help you play d4. So now if black plays like bishop c5, doesn't look like you've got control over this. So this is like major, the weakness of e4. And there's another main line of the Ruy Lopez called the open Ruy Lopez, which is also a line in which black attacks and takes e4 early on in the game. All right. So that's a potential advantage. Other things. Someone says that maybe the game is more imbalanced and white can castle queenside. Another person says you already have the opportunity of trading black's knight, which is the primary defender of the king if he castles kingside. So if you're looking to turn this into a kingside attack, we can put two different people's answers together and say that you're going to castle queenside and perhaps trade their best defender on the kingside. So there seem to be some opportunities for maybe more of like a strong kingside attack early on. Okay. So that is major, definitely. Okay. Good points. And definitely a very important difference between this and the Ruy Lopez is that in the Ruy Lopez, it's clear that white's going to castle kingside. Right? You've already moved both of these pieces. It would take you one move at some point to castle kingside, and it would take you 1, 2, 3, 4 moves minimum. Oh, plus 5. 5 moves minimum to castle queenside. So if you guys have played through 1,000 Ruy Lopez games in your lives, have you ever seen white castle queenside in the Ruy Lopez? I'm having a hard time remembering a single game in which white castles queenside in the Ruy Lopez. I'm struggling to come up with a single one. I think there was one Caruana game in the D3 Berlin in which he castled queenside recently, which was a great game. So that breaks what I was trying to say. But basically, I've almost never seen it happen, right? Now, in this opening, it seems like white's got 2 steps to castle queenside, or 1, 2, 3, 4 to castle kingside. So the odds of castling queenside have skyrocketed in the queenside Ruy Lopez. On the other hand, black started with knight f6. It still seems very plausible that black will castle kingside. So one major difference between the kingside and the queenside Ruy Lopez is that in the queenside Ruy Lopez, you are far, far more likely to see opposite side castled kings. If that's a factor that interests you, or a factor that you think should favor white, then that could be a reason to consider this opening more favorably. Okay? There's one more interesting advantage to the queenside Ruy Lopez, which is part of what we just said, the likelihood of castling queenside. What's the advantage of castling queenside? Like a strict advantage in castling queenside. Rook is already on the D file. Exactly. So if you're playing an impactful opening where you're trying to put pressure on the opponent and you're more interested in attacking them than defending yourself, castling queenside puts your rook on the D file in one move, whereas in most variations of the kingside Ruy Lopez, it's very common to see white. We've just seen this variation a few times, right? It's very common to see white spending a move putting their rook in the center, both to defend their e-pawn and to indirectly add pressure to e5 in case of a d4, ed4, e5 at some point. Okay? So instead, in the queenside Ruy Lopez, our rook will start out on the d file, right? And our king will be on c1. We could spend a move tucking our king, but if we've got enough control over the position, we might not need to play king b1 anytime early on, and we can use the extra pressure and presence, the pressure and presence of the rook on d1 to play more aggressively in the center. Okay? And that rook on the center file can be good for dissuading your opponent from counters with c5 or e5. So it's definitely notable. Okay? That's the other advantage to this opening compared to the kingside, is getting the rook onto the d file very, very quickly. All right. So, there are some variations where you can trade your bishop for the knight in order to play e4, in order to get control over e4. Personally, I like to play this with more tension, but just like with the Ruy Lopez, I mean, there are some people who trade and then they're easily able to achieve d4, right? There are variations like this. This was the old variation that Fischer used to always play, right? Something of this type. I don't know, always used to play. This was a Fischer variation. I think this variation's older than Fischer, right? This was already played in by Lasker against Capablanca. So anyway, This is an old school way to play the opening. It involves like the trade in order to get in d4. Similarly, in this variation, in this opening, there are lines where you could go early bishop takes f6 in order to play e4 if you wanted to. One variation that I've seen sometimes goes like this, like this, like this, and now bishop d3. And the point is that now you're going to be able to follow up with e4 off of that trade on f6. So there's definitely several variations like that involving making the trade in order to play e4. So there's exchange variations of the Queenside Ruy Lopez, just like of the Kingside Ruy Lopez, where you trade off the bishop pair in order to help you play e4. There's also like in the mainline Ruy Lopez's, you get to a point like we just saw in our game where you play c3 in order to follow up with d4 and keep this pawn center. And then remember this important move h3 to stop bishop g4. And now, for example, this defense for black. And white achieves this pawn center. Well, similarly, in the Queenside Ruy Lopez, there will be variations where you play queen d2 and g6 and castles and bishop g7 and f3 and castles and e4. Right? And here we didn't have to play moose rook e1 defending this. And we've achieved a strong central position. There's no way that line was first played in 1968, is there? Seriously? I doubt it. Must be an incomplete database that doesn't have old games. Okay, so both the Queenside and Kingside Ruy Lopez also have versions where you go f3 e4 or c3 d4. But one of the most important tricks in the Queenside Ruy Lopez is the transposition to the Blackmer-Deemer gambit. And that is why that is the other opening I've shown you this week in preparation for this one. So the very first time I ever played this was against my computer. This was back in the day when computers, like home computers, were maybe like 2400 FIDE strength. So my computer was about my strength, and I still used to play practice games against my computer back in the day. Now, as we've discussed, I don't find it very interesting to play against computers. I think Magnus Carlsen has expressed the same sentiment, that he doesn't find it that exciting to play against a computer and get whooped. So when I invented this new opening, when computers were weaker, like 3 years before, if I invented a new opening like this, the first person I would play it against would be myself, right? I don't remember which Fritz number it was, but 2 or 3 or something on some home computer, and it was like at about my rating at the time, right? I was maybe like 2350 FIDE strength, and my computer was maybe 2400 FIDE strength, and since I didn't concentrate that well, my computer usually beat me. Because it didn't understand that we were playing like just a casual game. We weren't playing a tournament game. We were just like messing around to like get an idea of things. But the computer was always like taking it seriously and beating me, which sucked for me. But yeah, the first time I ever played this, the computers were good enough that it was interesting to play against them, not so good that it was completely uninteresting. And so the computer played knight bd7. So if I take on f6, the computer can replace that knight and keep very strong control over d5 and e4. So I played the move queen d2. As I've already alluded to, there's a variation with queen d3 based on playing e4. In terms of like how to develop your queen, a lot of people aren't very clear on it. I think d2 is kind of a perfect square here. In general, your queen is like a quarterback. It sits back but has flexibility to like direct action in different parts of the board. I don't like queen d3 blocking my bishop on f1. So I like queen d2 supporting the bishop that's already out. So then my program played this move, knight b6. And suddenly I'm threatened with a kind of annoying knight c4. It's a weird move, but actually annoying. So you can consider here playing bishop takes f6. Although even then they might be able to throw in knight c4. But anyway, what occurred to me after black played knight b6, this is the very beginning of my investigation of this opening. What occurred to me was that black had just spent two moves putting this knight on a so-so square. And I wanted to stop knight c4. And maybe instead of playing, the move I want to play is f3, and then knight c4 is annoying. So maybe instead of playing f3, what if I speed things up and play e4? And play a Blackmer-Deemer gambit where my opponents played the early knight to b6 defense. I mean, not terribly useless. The knight can go to d5. That can be a valid maneuver. But committing to knight d7 to b6 to d5 on move 2 or 3 so early, so much time, eliminates a lot of variations of the Deemer that might be problematic for me. I don't need to worry about an early c5 or e5 probably. There's no bishop g4 to trade my knight. So it occurred to me, hey, why don't I do this? And I don't remember too much of the game, but I think play proceeded like this. Something of this sort. And I ended up getting a really, really nice position. I don't remember even if I played f3 or knight e2 to c3 here. Right? You can play to just try and recover your pawn instead of sacking it. So knight e2 is very plausible here, going to a good square. You could look to attack black with knight b5 and bishop f4. At the same time looking to just win back your pawn. You can also play like f3 with the idea of playing a Blackmer-Deemer style game like this. So I don't remember much of the game, but I'm pretty sure it was in this variation. And miraculously, I won the game. And I think that's a lot of what inspired me to end up spending a lot of my time learning and playing this particular opening. Is like I thought of it on my own, but then when I sat down and tested it against the computer, my very first game was this extremely satisfying game where I saw this idea of transposing into a Deemer, and then ever since then I've thought like, oh, what an interesting little opening to have up your sleeve. So I think that's one of the important points about this opening versus the Ruy Lopez is that there's a lot of interesting lines where at some point you play e4, they take, you play f3, they take, and you play knight f3, and you're in a really, really nice Blackmer-Deemer type position where you've quickly castled queenside. I don't see that happen very much in the Ruy Lopez, but I wonder if that is a lesson that could be applied over to the Ruy Lopez as well. What if now we played d4 before they've played d6, right? And then, okay, so there's a lot of pressure on e5, so they pretty much have to surrender it. And now instead of playing something like this, which is the famous trap, and instead of playing one of these e5 lines, which goes something like this, 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 what if instead of any of that, we now played c3? And then pawn, and just tried to play this kind of position. I wonder if this would be any good. I wonder if there's any room to do this in the Ruy Lopez. I'll have to investigate that next. That is an interesting thought. If you can play the Ruy Lopez with a delayed Black Redeemer approach, or delayed Gurren Gambit approach. I suppose one possible knock on it would be your opponent playing d3 here, avoiding what you want, but honestly, you still have the central advantage with this, and you've avoided making that knight trade and getting your bishop trapped. So this isn't like a useless move at all. It keeps them from trapping your bishop and trading it off. And then you can just develop from here. Yeah, I don't know. More food for thought. So that is what I see as some of the like fundamental factors in the position between the Ruy Lopez, one of the two standard openings of chess, and the Queenside Ruy Lopez, one of the sidelines of chess. And